I'm not going to show you a technique for creating terrains specifically for the purpose of displacements. And uh, we're going to start out by creating what I like to call just kind of a pure sculpted terrain. There's two different ways to do this. I'm going to start by adding in a standard terrain. We can go to Edit Object and hit Reset. And now, just using the Sculpt tools, we can create a terrain that is just the sculpted geometry. So just the displacement 3D layer. The other method is to add in a procedural terrain, and whether or not you have zero edges won't make that much of a difference. But what you can do is go to the procedural and just reset the function. You can then use the 3D tools from there. The difference between these methods is basically the space in which you're sculpting in, or the overall height amount. Each method has its own benefits, depending on using force extension amounts in order to modify the overall output. Also being able to adjust the clipping range because of that while using the procedural. One of the benefits of using a standard terrain is that we're going to end up with a standard terrain in the end anyway. And it might be better to stick with that. Plus we have additional options being able to equalize the terrain, which will help. So I'm going to be using just the standard terrain method. So I'm going to reset the terrain. And so now we can begin using the 3D tools, and only using the 3D tools. We can reduce the resolution of the terrain 256 by 256. My default's 512 by 512. But what we're going to do is just start sculpting out. And it's really important to pay attention to the geometry so that we're not creating any erratic areas. This method is fairly flexible for a lot of different things because we are allowed to just sculpt out the geometry and not have any interaction between the 2D layer, which can cause jagged edges if that information is changed based on the displacement. And if we switch to the wireframe, we'll have a much better idea of how much stretching there's going to be, if any. It might be a good idea to avoid using the inflate tool for this, at least in very large areas. That's because it really modifies the geometry, stretching it too much, and we need to have a fairly even terrain or an even mesh for this. It's going to give us the best result and the best possible displacement. So what you can do is just go through, and keeping the geometry below 1,000,000 polygons is probably going to be the best way to achieve this effect, just because what we're going to end up with is a baked mesh from this. And there's a couple of reasons why. I'll be showing you once we get to that point. So I'm just going to continue to sculpt out a terrain. Another thing is you will probably want to avoid extremely high areas if you have a lower resolution. So until you step up the resolution a little bit higher, avoid very, very tall zones. For the most part, just sculpt out a basic idea for the terrain because we're going to be letting the displacement map really take care of the geometry. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a slightly more interesting sculpt. So just remember the main thing is avoiding uneven polygons throughout the mesh. And I'm still working on this a little. I do want to mention a good idea is to slightly raise the mesh overall, and you can see my color map is blue, and to make sure that none of that information is clipped out, I do want to do an overall level raise, and what I'm going to use is my line filter, which is going to give me a very even amount, increase the size all the way, reduce flow, switch to the sculpt method, and try to get that normal to face up, and then just raise it up. And the longer I hold this down, I'll be able to see that color changing, and I just want to bring it more towards the green and the higher point within the elevation. So it doesn't have to be much, but that little bit will really end up helping later. So I'm still going through and improving this. Another thing you'll want to avoid is excessive usage of the sculpting brush throughout traveling across large amounts of the terrain. The reason for this is since the normal direction stays exactly the same, it will end up stretching polygons possibly too much and creating a fairly uneven mesh. So it is probably going to be best just to stick with the freeform tool. Not that I'm saying you can't use the sculpt brush, just really pay attention to how you're using it. Because for the most part we want to stick with the freeform in order to be able to conform to the mesh and have a much better turnout in the end. Also avoid going too low into the terrain. If you're using the procedural terrain method, instead of starting with a standard terrain, you will have the ability to dip the terrain down a little lower than the initial creation or the initial level. So sometimes that's helpful. So I'm really not going to do much more to this. Also, smooth out anything that looks at all jagged. Stay away from very small brushes unless you want to start defining the higher resolution of the terrain. So I'm just going to add a few more elevation differences, and then we're going to start the process. Okay, so now my terrain is pretty much ready. One thing I'm going to do just before I click OK, close this out, is I do have some stretched areas. So if I need to, I can go in and kind of smooth those out. Another thing I like to do when I'm doing this is to switch to the smooth brush, increase size all the way, reduce the flow slightly, and just kind of click once or twice to give an overall smoothing. By doing that, and what you can do is undo afterwards, but the areas with the most amount of change are going to be the ones that are stretched the most. So it's a really good way to see any problem areas that may show up. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and it's very important now that you save the scene. Every single step of the way should be saved when doing this process. I mean, granted, that's a good thing to do anyway, but for this, we have a huge possibility of losing information because eventually we will reach a point where this terrain is no longer a terrain and just a mesh. And that's going to happen fairly quickly. So I've called this scene Pure 3D, which you'd be able to load in because it's included with the training. Another good idea is after you create or do that first save, to save it again with the name of the next stage or the next step. That way you don't use the keyboard shortcut for save and accidentally save over your original file. That way you have two copies, and then you can just save it and be one step ahead with the file name. So the next step is the material. I'm going to reset the material that's currently on the terrain. So all we have is just this very basic overall material, and we're going to create somewhat of a custom one using presets that come with View and just kind of customizing those. So we're going to edit the material, and I'm not going to worry about the color channel yet. What we really want to focus on right now is the bump. Make sure our mapping mode is set to world standard, which is going to be very important because the scale size of a standard terrain and a baked object, or just a mesh in general, and every other object in the scene is completely different. So if you're using object modes, the overall scale could possibly change, and that's really going to affect our output. So what I want to do is just double click on the bump production, and these are fractals that have come with View in the content that's installed with View. You can go to Fractals and select the sedimentary rock. Now, we do want to make a few changes to this, but first let's just take a look at our overall scale. The current size is far too small, so we will need to increase the scale. I do want to have much larger areas that are going to be displaced and not these small uniform lines. So let's go ahead and bring the scale up to 6, and that does look slightly better. I might want to take it down a little, but also keep in mind, because we are in the world mode, if we stretch it upward or scale on the Z, that we will extend the material. But you also want to make sure you're avoiding very high Z levels and a lot of stretching, because it will stretch out those polygons and really reduce the amount we have to work with. And what we really want to do is displace the horizontal direction rather than the vertical direction, because otherwise we could just be using a regular terrain and not even have to worry about displacement mapping. So what we want to do is set up first just this bump. Not having displacement mapping on gives us a much quicker render and a very easy way to tell exactly what's going to be displaced. Now, I also want to use the dependent on slope, and this is going to be important for a couple of reasons, and previewing it in the bump now at this point will give us a better idea of the overall displacement. Sometimes this feature, the dependent on slope, is going to be necessary in order to be able to get a good horizontal displacement. Looking at the terrain bump at the moment, and as it is right now, also gives us a good idea of what settings need to be changed within the material before we displace. If you take a look, there's a lot of very fine grit within the material. The roughness setting is possibly too intense. So we can go into the fractals, reduce the roughness settings, and we can also get a good idea of where we're going to run into problems later. Anything showing up now in the form of ray tracing errors in a render are going to be problematic areas later, so something to pay attention to. And just going back to the render, another thing I want to note is that for very fine details and this roughness, well, we're mostly going to be getting rid of it, but you do want to avoid those being below 0 for the number output, because the displacement going inward is going to cause more problems than displacement outward. And without an inward displacement, it's just not going to look right, because you do have the ability to displace outward only, but I've found that it just doesn't look as good. So just right-clicking on that preview for the bump, we're going to modify each one of these fractals that's controlling the overall bump output. And what I want to do is reduce roughness on basically everything, just kind of bringing it down around 0.5. Another thing you can do, basically, I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in here. Sometimes the roughness will add a detail that isn't possible without the roughness on. So what you can do is increase the smallest feature amount to remove some of those areas, but still get some of the roughness values. So there's a lot of little tweaking you can do between all of these different fractals. And I do want this top variable roughness to be the main output. So what I can do is increase the gain to increase that overall value. Just make sure that you are not going beyond the +1, -1 output. If you have automatic extension on and the function node preview open, which you can access both the output observer and node preview up here at the top, the function editor. With automatic extension on, once you go beyond that value of 1, either positive or negative, the automatic extension will update and show you the value. So if I increase the gain to a very high amount, we can see that extension is now 3.78. In view 8, displacement mapping is confined to that range. Everything else will be clipped out. So it's very important to pay attention to that. And there are still some very rough areas, so I may need to go into the fractal a little further and either reduce the roughness or, in some cases, just either remove part of that function or even scale it up larger. So it really depends on your final output, but pretty much what you're seeing from the bump is going to be your displacement. It's just a really good idea to work with the bump independently before anything else, really to make sure that everything's going to show up correctly. And now the top main fractal, I do want to modify just that scale. I want to avoid very tiny z-scales at the moment. We can always adjust that later. Now that is creating some of those larger creases, so I will end up reducing the gain of this one because I do like the look of the other fractals, but it's really at this point just kind of somewhat of a tweak fest to get to where we need to be, and of course saving before we move on any further, so we can always come back to this material. And I am going to end up reducing the scale of the material down to 3. Also keep in mind that the dependent on slope option is turned on. So if you need to, you can turn that off for the moment, sometimes while you're working on the bump, just to get an overall idea of the fractal without any reduction. And you really just want to get rid of these fine little gritty areas. And if they're showing up too much on the areas without a lot of slope, that can also cause some problems. So I'm going to go and refine this a little, and then save it out. And I'm just working on that bump fractal at the moment. I also wanted to note that you will need to modify turbulence nodes because they do have an equal roughness amount showing up as harmonics and scaling, also the amplitude. So you will also need to kind of watch those and make sure that you don't have any very impacting settings, because sometimes, especially harmonics in some cases, can really cause too much distortion depending on the overall scale or the wavelength. So do pay attention to that as well. Also, because I want to create more of even lines and kind of straight lines across the terrain, you will want to avoid any width rotation settings, because then you'll have a completely uneven line. So unless you're defining it independently with a math node of rotation and twist on the vector, it's best to avoid the width rotation settings for defining those horizontal lines. So this is what I've ended up with for the bump, and you can load this in the pure 3D material version. So now we can move on to the next step. So I'm going to save a new file, and material displace is going to be the next name. And what we're going to do is start taking a look at the displacement. So we can turn on displacement mapping, and I'm going to add the bump to the displaced surface, because we will end up putting the bump back on the object after we bake it. And what I'm going to do is increase the depth to about a value of 3. So if you want to increase the output of the displacement, just make sure that within the function editor that you have the values between +1, -1, and then any additional displacement or extrusion you would want to achieve with the depth. So let's go ahead and take a look at the displacement. So just with the default settings, no dependent on slope options or no restriction of the normal, we can see a slight curvature on the sides where it starts to dip in and conform to the bump map, or what we originally had set up as the bump. Now, I don't really want any displacement vertically, so I'm going to turn on dependent on slope in the material, increase it to around 80%, and for the direction, I'm going to choose horizontal only, and then edit the function. By choosing horizontal only, it added a setup of nodes where we have normal options connected to the object, and then an XYZ product. By setting it to 0, it is not using any of the Z information. I like to just modify that 0 to around 0.1 or so, sometimes a little higher, basically just reducing the displacement on that direction rather than removing it completely, because sometimes it'll cause tears or a poor displacement. So overall, because the bump itself was already very much a horizontal fractal, there isn't too much change, but it will end up helping in the end. So I am going to just increase my Z-scale a little, and depending on your output, what you're going to be using this terrain for, you could keep it in the current state, just displacing the geometry at render time. For animation, that's just not going to be a good idea. You'll run into a lot of problems, and mainly it's going to affect the speed. What I like to do is get to a point where I have just a mesh from that displacement, and it's going to end up being easier to work with for many different reasons. So now looking from another direction, kind of getting an idea of the overall displacement. But there really isn't too much going on. It's not very interesting. So continue to kind of increase some of the settings, modify scales and whatnot, in order to get this to look a little bit better, and possibly change some of the 3D geometry. Another good idea to do is to increase the quality boost to around a value of 2. And that way, it'll give you a little better representation what it's going to look like. And even just a small change in that quality boost made a huge improvement overall for the look of the terrain. So we can adjust some of the other settings, modify the scales. I think I'm going to bring down the overall scale to 4. And keep in mind that the depth and the bump depth are really dependent on the scale and the position of the camera. So your output will change. and it is starting to look a little better. I can also start to raise some of the other areas of the terrain up to make them more vertical, and that way avoid the dependent on slope elimination or just extruding horizontally. Another thing I want to note is if you do run into a problem where you make a change, now this typically happens when you make major changes between the settings, like reevaluate material distribution after displacement, or change it between the displacement direction. Most of these checkboxes could trigger this. Basically, it's where you won't see the displacement in the render anymore. If that happens, what you can typically do is purge the memory. So go to File, Purge Memory, and then just move the camera. Sometimes you have to use the camera control center to do that, and then it'll typically fix the problem because it's just a little memory error when that happens. And because we mostly need geometry on the edges, I'm going to edit the terrain, and now using the inflate tool, go around the tops to stretch out the polygons and move them more to the edges. This will give us more geometry on the sides of the terrain and give us a little bit more to work with. We could also push up some of the sides. We could use the Sculpt tool and move different areas up, kind of moving that geometry into the vertical areas. So there's a lot of ways we could customize this and get it to look better with the displacement. And because we have so much vertical geometry now, I do want to start thinking about subdividing or reducing the brush size and increasing the overall displacement geometry in order to give us a little better of a mesh. So before I do that, I'm going to save out the scene and then subdivide the geometry, because once it's subdivided and the displacement geometry is increased on the terrain, we will not be able to undo that action. So after saving, I'm going to go back into the terrain editor and use my no effect brush just to trigger the displacement change and scale down the size of the brush and just go into each of the four main quadrants and just subdivide it so that we have 524K polygons. It's a good idea now to turn off the wireframe mode and just pay attention to the output number to make sure that we don't divide any higher. We can then switch our filter and begin sculpting some of the finer details and giving us a little more of an interesting terrain, which can be used directly as a displacement or to eventually reach the point which we'll be at eventually once we bake the terrain. But making all of these steps first is very important, because once the terrain is baked, it is no longer a terrain object and just a mesh. And the terrain is now starting to look a lot more interesting. Because we have a higher mesh resolution, we don't need to have as high of a displacement amount, because we can now achieve some of that with just the sculpting tools within the object. So this is with those reduced settings. I also want to note that the higher the geometry becomes within the sculpted amount for the displacement of the terrain, the more roughness and finer settings we can use within the fractal for the displacement without destroying any of the geometry too much. So we could either keep the terrain like this. Of course, there are issues with the shadows. whenever you have this amount of displacement with this kind of a terrain, and even increasing the level of the original 2D mesh will not really help that out too much, and there's only so much quality boosts can do. And that's basically because the way the geometry currently works, it's not being merged, or the points aren't really being merged before the displacement occurs entirely. So sometimes there's issues with that. Also, it has to do with the mesh smoothing and things like that. So we're going to take a look at now baking and the process to bake this terrain. There's two ways to do this. The easy way, which doesn't really give you a good result, and then a much better way. So the easiest way is just to right-click and bake to polygons. Now the only problem with that is we're going to have a lot of tearing in the terrain, and there's really not much we can do with it at that point. So a better idea is to bake the mesh without the displacement, and I'm talking about the material displacement. So what I want to do is turn off the displacement mapping, and I'm also going to go ahead and save out a new version of the scene since we're baking. And with the displacement mapping off, we don't have to worry about the displacement layer affecting the output. I do want to note, if you have a procedural terrain, it will more than likely not take into account the sculpted information. So you will have to convert it to a standard terrain first. So we can bake it to polygons, and this output is slightly determined by the pixel amount geometry. So I'm going to double the resolution to 512 by 512, and if we're not getting a good enough mesh, we can increase that, and it should be able to allow us to get a higher geometry. Also keep in mind that the estimated amount of points in polygons is incorrect, and rarely ever it will show up right unless you already have a baked mesh under certain situations. I also want to note that changes in the slider really exist in large steps. Pretty much after you reach the halfway point, you're almost at the highest amount always, and it kind of stays consistent at that value. So 25% and 75% typical values, and end up being about the same. So now we have a little over 500,000 polys. I'm going to undo the baking, go back, bake it again with a higher amount, and we're going to see the exact same output. So it is being determined by that pixel layer, and what the displacement mesh is doing is distorting that output. So I'm going to increase it to 1024 by 1024, and then bake it. And we should be able to get 1,000,000 polys, hopefully. If not, we might need to increase the 3D geometry. I'm going to turn this up all the way. And it does look like, in this case, with the displacement, the polygon amounts actually end up changing quite a bit at the end. So between 75% and 100%, there's a drastic change between the output. We now have a 2,000,000 polygon terrain, which might just be the next step. If you don't have a system to handle that amount, then you'll definitely want to reduce. And what I'm going to try to do this time is bake it just slightly under, try around 90%, and see what we can get. But we might be restricted because it does have to be subdivided in certain stages. So I'm going to go back, reduce, and so sometimes you just got to play around with it until you get the right amount. But there is one other way. I'm going to try edit the object, increase that amount, and I'm going to try a lower setting for the bake and see what our output can become. Because we might be able to get around the 1,000,000 polygon range, which is what I'm hoping for, but it looks like it probably is going to jump between 50% and 100 to pretty much return the exact same output. And it doesn't look like it's going to be possible. So that's because of the displacement geometry being the size that it is, along with the pixel amount. So if you don't feel comfortable working with this amount of geometry, or your system just can't handle it, then you may need to decrease the amount. Now, I have access to other applications, so for me, I'm going to end up going back and bringing it down to the 500K, because I also want to get it out of view in order to merge the points together. Another thing to note is that camera motion does store frequently in the undo operation, so if you need to switch over to the perspective view for kind of shifting yourself around the terrain, and that way you don't have to worry about creating undo operations. So we'll bake it to polygons using the lower resolution, which is going to be 500K. So the next thing I want to do is export this object out of view in order to be able to merge the points. So what I can do is go to File and Export Object, and I'm going to be using a Cinema 4D export. I'm going to use Cinema 4D for this. Because the terrain is already baked, the resolution won't matter. It's going to export the entire mesh regardless of this slider amount. If you do need the UV map, granted the UV map you're going to get from this is not going to be really all that useful, because there's going to be a lot of overlapping of the geometry. But what you can do is generate any of the maps. Just if you want, you could do a color map and then use a very low resolution. Take little time to calculate. And since there's no material on it, we don't really need a higher resolution, but it's just enough to get the UV map out if needed. I'm not going to worry about the UV, so I'm just going to select the Cinema 4D export and then export this out. So I've just gone ahead and loaded in the terrain into Cinema. What I'm going to be doing is selecting the object, going to the polygon mode, and under functions just using optimize to first just remove any points that aren't needed, and I might need to change my settings a little depending on the scale. I'm not really worried about removing any extra polygons at the moment, just primarily merging those points together. Another operation for that would be to use a connect object. So we can add a connect object, place the terrain in there, and then make it editable. And that will help remove or make sure all the polygons are working correctly. Another thing you could choose to do, but can vary depending on the type of displacement you're creating, is to remove the triangles. So if we untriangulate, we can set the max value 90 degrees. And now the problem is the way that view generates the information, or the polygons, you're going to have a lot of interesting looking setups because of the way everything is divided, so you might not be able to get a good enough mesh to displace if the polygons are too erratic, but it is a possibility. Vue is typically used to working with its own type of object setup, so it might be easier just to stick with the triangles. Also, if needed, you could export that 2 million polygon version if you need a much better mesh. If you are working with ZBrush along with Vue terrains, then the merge point and possibly untriangulating is going to be necessary. Merging the points is absolutely necessary, which means a direct export from Vue into ZBrush is not possible, just because the mesh is completely torn and not connected correctly. If you don't have access to any other application, any other major 3D application to perform this kind of operation, you can use Blender, which is a free open source solution. Just go to blender.org or blender3d.org. There's a link provided with the training in the links folder, and it'll have an operation that'll allow you to merge the points together. So if you don't have access to a major 3D application, you can also use Blender, which is also actually a very powerful application. Just lacks some render power. So now what I want to do is export this back out and open it up within Vue. And if you're using Xstream, you can just do this directly within your main application, just using the commands from each program, essentially not even having to go into the standalone. So back in Vue, just go to File and Import Object, and then choose the file loaded in. I exported it from Cinema as a OBJ format, so wavefront. I already have it loaded in. Another thing you could do is to select the existing object, right-click, and replace by, and then you could import an object. Whether you want to keep proportions or fit, you can choose. I typically just load it in and avoid the other operations, because I have run into problems before with them. So now we have the optimized terrain. Edit the object. We can adjust the smoothing angle. And actually, one thing I should have checked was the direction of the normals. There's a possibility normals were inverted, but Vue does have the ability to invert the normals. So even if they were facing the wrong direction, it shouldn't really matter. I'm going to set the smoothing angle up to 180. So in the mesh options, so right-click, edit options. Save a new version of this. And the file size is going to get larger with the extra mesh in there. And if you have a 2 million polygon mesh, it's really going to take up a lot more space. It's also a good idea sometimes to save the object as a VOB format, and then that can help with file sizes. So I'm going to save a new version of this for the VOB file, and then you could load that in at any other time. So then you could go to File, load the object, and the file size is about half of the wavefront file. So now we can take the material from the original terrain, copy it, right-click, paste the material on the new terrain. You could also open the material summary and drag and drop the materials. So I'm going to delete terrain 4, and what we can do now is turn on the displacement mapping. So now we're going to be able to displace this terrain. Okay, I did run into a bit of a problem. As you can see, the displacement is a lot different. The scale related to this terrain is different than the other object. So we may need to adjust the scale. And that's if we're using the imported version. I'm also going to go ahead and just invert the normals and apparently crash the application. So it looks like we're going to have to approach this from another method. This was working for me earlier, but if this is going to be happening, then it's not reliable enough. So it was a possibility that it was a memory issue, and you could file, purge the memory, and just try it again. But I mean, at this point, it looks like it's just having problems overall. So if it's not stable enough at the moment, then I am just not going to use it. And instead, we're going to stick with the view baked geometry. We might need to increase the polygon amount, though, to avoid tearing issues. So let's take a look at turning on the displacement mapping for the original baked terrain, which will end up looking better. And just want to make sure that the scales are set correctly. So what I'm going to do is just do a quick render and make sure that there wasn't a problem between the terrain size and then also the baked object size. So with the preview render, it looks like it should be acceptable. What I want to do is edit the material, and I'm going to increase the quality boost all the way up to 4. And now we can bake to our, I guess would be our final mesh. Keep in mind that once you bake a mesh with displacement mapping on, it will remove the bump part of the material. So I'm going to copy the material. You could also save it out to preserve it, but we do have it saved in other versions, so we can always open it back up and access it. Right click, bake to polygons, and now we can choose the mesh resolution based on whether or not we want to subdivide it. So I'm going to go over 50% and kind of the in-between marker, which looks like now the estimated amount of polygons should be correct. And we should get around a 2 million polygon mesh once this is complete, if everything goes well. So now we can see the baked mesh, and because there are some errors and some tears, I might need to activate smoothing before we bake it. Either that, or we can take this mesh and export it to clean it up in another application. Running the decimation features from view really won't help us with this terrain because they are just a little too unpredictable. If we edit the object, we can see that the max smoothing angle is currently set to 181. Now, that's actually beyond the amount we can manually put in. 180 is max. So if you modify this value, it will change the smoothing angle, because it does need that 181 in order to take care of some of the geometry. But the problematic areas that we're looking at are also the areas that we're having issues with the ray tracing, and you could see that earlier. So having that indicator can be really helpful, and it's just a matter of modifying the geometry. And really, we might just have to scale down the z-axis and rebake it if you're having issues or problems even correcting the mesh. Another thing you could do is if we file and merge the scene with the last option that we had, or the last terrain before we baked it, what we can do is go into that terrain, edit the object, and then show the scene. And now we have a very good idea of where the problem areas are, which means we can go in and work on the terrain, modifying the geometry to find out exactly where the problem is coming from. Really, I think that the problem with this terrain is the dependent on slope or the only displace horizontal options. It also looks as if some of the issues are directly caused by the way that the polygons are facing as they're extruded upward. The more that they tend to angle off to the side, we see more distortion. So that might be another thing to keep in mind, smoothing out, repositioning the terrain. It's also a possibility of just the way the material was set up. But being able to use this overlay is a really nice method for correcting that. I'm going to go ahead and just close this out. And it may take a bit of trial and error, but let's take a look at this object, which does not have the bump function. And I did just clear that out. I should be able to paste that material because it should still be stored in the memory. Make sure I turn off displacement mapping. And now we can see the bump with the mesh. The bump map surprisingly will help a lot with this tearing, and sometimes it can almost remove it. If you really are just having trouble getting rid of the tears, what I would suggest is using a shadow map, using a soft shadow map, and that can really help eliminate some of the more obvious errors. And it does look like we have more than one light in the scene still from that other scene. So make sure we do this on the existing sun. And it is improved, but not great. In this case, I would really want to start with that 2 million polygon mesh and then displace that terrain. The process is going to take a little bit longer, but since I don't have the ability to reliably export and import back the object, I think it's going to be one of the only ways to really get this to look a little better. So this is obviously a bigger issue with animation. With still a little bit of post work, wouldn't take long to correct some of those issues. And I just want to show you, this is the terrain baked with the displacement checked on. So you can see that there are a lot of problems, which is why you really need to bake the terrain first and then bake the displacement afterwards, because this looks much worse than the other version did. And now this is the displaced 2 million polygon mesh. So going back to the terrain, baking it at the higher quality setting to get the 2 million polygons, and then running the displacement bake afterwards, I ended up with a much better looking terrain. And most of these errors are very easily hidden with the bump map. So with the bump map back on, what I've done is go into the function and just increase those roughness settings back to kind of where they were, get rid of the smallest feature amounts in order to just increase some of the depth and the quality of the bump. But now we have a nice looking terrain, and let's go ahead and take a look at a render. I'm just going to adjust sunlight a little, keeping in mind though that this will definitely increase the file size and memory requirements for the scene, but it's going to render a lot quicker. So that looks much better. Probably needs a little bit of work on some areas, just the material. And this is with ray tracing and not the shadow map. So the shadow map will pretty much eliminate any of those polygon errors. And overall, I think some of the displacement problems were really caused just by the way we limited the displacement on each of the axes. So it might be a matter of just removing the slope option, or just kind of playing around with it. Another thing to keep in mind that the bake process is a single core process. So if you're using a multi-core processor, which pretty much everybody is these days, it is only going to use one core. So if you've got an 8-core processor, you'll see about 12 to 13% of your processor being used to bake the terrain. But even then, it's still it's fairly fast. So if you need to try it a couple of times, limiting the options. And I would love to be able to give you a defined value for this, but unfortunately it does depend on the material and whatever type of displacement you're using. So hopefully I've given you a few guidelines to kind of go by to really help improve the quality that you can achieve with this technique. So we can now populate an ecosystem on this, and I will note that getting underneath some of the overhangs might not be possible with a standard population. You might have to paint that in. Although using the populate near foreign objects or under foreign objects as possible may help. So now we can go ahead and load in a material for this to modify the color and really kind of finish up the scene. I do suggest using that same bump, or at least using it along with another bump, because it will really bring out the features. It's also a possibility to continue and use another displacement with this high resolution mesh. So you can really layer it and keep extending the process. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of modify the material a little. So one thing we could do is edit the material, double click on the color production, and under color productions I found that the brown-white fractal looks pretty nice for this. And then what we could even do is connect some of these options. Maybe instead of using these fractals, just connect to one of the fractals from the bump in order to get it to match up a little better. Also, under effects, it might be easier to reduce the contrast amount, and that can help improve some of the lighting. And I'm going to go to the sunlight and just set up a shadow map. I'm going to set my ratio to 2, and the ratio is based on the frame size. You can increase the density, basically the shadow map, by increasing the ratio amount. So the bump map needs a little work because it's not as rough as it should be because of all the modifications made to it in order to get a better displacement. So we could even take that fractal that we just replaced from the color and connect that to the bump. So we go to the bump map, edit the function, and we can see that that fast Perlin fractal is still in there. So what I can do is, since we already have a combiner set up, we can just add in taking the connection at the top, because the combiner node will continuously add new inputs And now we can add in the bump of this fractal to use, in this case, the multiply. So we're going to multiply this output with that fast Perlin fractal. So the material still needs a little bit of work. Maybe just an adjustment to the lighting here and there. But for the most part, we now basically have our terrain. A lot faster rendering than having to calculate the displacement, and more reliable than the other version we had, which was exported before. Since this terrain is pretty much finished, we would be able to export this one out, merge the points, optimize it a little easier, and get it back into the program, and shouldn't have too many problems with that. It's once further modifications are made that you end up running into issues.